funding for the Windsors, a royal family, has been provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the annual financial support of viewers like you.
Like Windsor Castle, the family which took its name seemed ancient, imperishable. This is the last great dynasty in Europe. Its rituals date back 1,000 years to the Saxon kings. There is an element of magic that binds the British to their monarchy. And a strong element of calculation.
One of the ways in which the British monarchy has survived has been its capacity to reinvent itself from one generation to another, and has been the capacity of the British people to see in the monarchy itself as an institution different things at different times which have resonated with their ordinary lives and hopes and expectations.
The royal family provides the British with a soap opera of sovereigns.
One of the functions of the royal family in the minds of people is to be the continuing story of Peyton Place. Birth, death, marriages. And of course, in that story, there is always somebody who's not actually behaving as they should be, or the Dark Princess, if you like. The story goes on.
It is a story of powerful women and of men forced to wait a lifetime for the throne. It is the story of a charming prince who would disappoint a nation.
He was the most famous man in the world. He was the blue-eyed boy of the whole world. Everybody wanted to touch him. I mean, he looked divine, and he had this terrific charm and a smile and the easy manner.
A charming prince who became king and was himself disappointed.
It was very a painful moment. And I had to say, I'm afraid, sir, she is not going to have the privilege of being Royal Highness. And perhaps I shouldn't say it, it's too intimate. His Royal Highness burst into tears on my shoulder.
My first word.
It is the story of a king painfully shy, who became a symbol of World War II patriotism. A story of dedication and service.
There is a motto which has been borne by many of my ancestors, a noble motto: I serve. I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
A story of a new generation of royals.
She hadn't had love affairs, and she was very beautiful, and she came from a very good home. And I did say to my son-in-law, her father, I did say, it's the first time the Queen of England's ever been chosen by a referendum, because he really was.
A new generation that promised to be less stuffy and more with it.
All these men around here.
Love you!
I'll see you later.
I thought she was a splendid girl, but I think basically unsuited to the task of being a royal princess.
Fairy tales, even when they go wrong, are a wonderful copy.
Oh, God. Sometimes I need you several times a week. So do I. I need you all the week, all the time.
To all, to each, a happy Christmas. God bless you.
It is the story of the royal family's clever use of the media.
Perhaps never before has a newsreel camera captured such charming informal close-ups of almost every member of our royal family.
The first film about the royal family was one of the most skillfully executed propaganda exercises which I certainly can remember. It was a masterstroke, a superb piece of public relations. I suspect a lot of other people too have progressively wondered if the royal family are prepared to make a film taking you into their house, taking you to their picnics, then why shouldn't the paparazzi sneak around in rhododendrons taking pictures of royal princesses bathing?
I think it is the Queen that one's so desperately sorry for. It's difficult for her to understand somebody who doesn't have a sense of duty. Everybody thinks in a way, what fun to be the Queen if you can be the Queen for a day. But for a lifetime to have that life.
Seeing what she looked upon as her own home go up in flames was devastating. And it came in a year when she'd had quite enough blows to withstand.
The Windsors is the story of a royal family. In May 1935, Britain's King George V celebrated 25 years on the throne, his silver jubilee.
How can I express what is in my heart? As I passed this morning through cheering multitude to and from St. Paul's Cathedral, as I thought there of all that these 25 years have brought to me, to my country and my empire, how could I fail to be most deeply moved?
I will remember it all my life because it was such an exciting day. He was the governor and you all had to look up to him and I was proud to be British and look up to a man like him because I thought he was a very good man.
They look this way with a little wave and that way with a little wave. You get something in your inside when you see them. You think to yourself, oh, and I don't know, it's a funny feeling you get that you want to cry or something like that.
Royalty was somebody very much aloof from us in those days. There was no intimate talk about them like there is today, which is a terrible mistake. And they were therefore was something very precious that you thought of with great awe.
George V's Silver Jubilee was more than an anniversary. It was a celebration of the survival of the monarchy. He had led Britain through crises like the First World War, which had destroyed many of Europe's monarchies.
I can only say to you, my very dear people, that the Queen and I thank you from the depth of our hearts for all the loyalty and, may I say, the love with which this day and always you have surrounded us.
I suppose that as King and Queen, they had a knack of getting things right, setting standards of public behavior, of visible behavior, of, as I say, getting things right. It's a very, very important knack, and I don't think it's mostly due to luck.
George V had become a symbol of everything British. He was the father of the House of Windsor. To his granddaughters Elizabeth and Margaret, he was Grandpapa England. George V was the son of Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. His grandmother was Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria's children and grandchildren married into most of the royal families of Europe. One of George V's cousins was the Tsar of Russia. Another was the Kaiser of Germany. These foreign links were to haunt him throughout his life. George was not brought up to be king. His elder brother Eddie was.
Queen Victoria once described them as wild as hawks. I can't manage them at all. And they were very undisciplined as little boys. They had a tutor, and he taught them how to shoot with bow and arrow. And he would run through the woods at Sandringham, pretending to be a deer, and they would be allowed to shoot at him.
When George was only 12, he was sent away to join the Navy with his brother Prince Eddie. Life aboard ship was rigorous and Spartan, and taught them discipline. George did poorly in his studies, but Eddie was hopeless. And Eddie was heir to the throne.
Prince Eddie was a few years older, but far stupider. There was a sort of lethargy about him. He didn't always connect, and also his private life had certain shadows over it.
Eddie's life had been dogged by sexual scandal. He died suddenly from pneumonia when George was 26. To the private relief of the family, George became heir to the throne. He also inherited Eddie's fiancée, the penniless German Princess Mary of Teck. They were married within months.
People have said that that was just a marriage of convenience, but it really wasn't. And I think probably there had been something going on perhaps slightly beforehand. But although they were very shy and inhibited and people thought they were a cold little couple, they wrote each other the most touching love letters, saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry that I'm so stiff when I'm with you, but really, I do love you, although I can't actually tell you so, I have to write it." And they understood each other perfectly.
In early newsreels, George was seen by his future subjects as leading a blameless and active life.
King George V was a sailor king who had spent his life in the Navy and was not an intellectual. Someone wrote about him, "Prince of sportsmen, peerless shot, but happiest aboard his yacht." He really had great talent for doing the ordinary thing. He represented it always that it was good in the British character, like prudence, loyalty, discipline.
George's homely virtues would be severely tested. In 1910, he succeeded his father as the King of Great Britain and Ireland and Emperor of India. In the winter of 1911, King George and Queen Mary travelled to India to take part in the greatest imperial pageant ever staged, the Delhi Durbar. The massed millions of India bowed to George V, the King Emperor, ruler of the dominions beyond the seas and symbol of an empire on which the sun never set.
There was this little king sitting on his throne with officials all round, and even the fact he was just rather a little man made it all the more impressive. You felt that here was this little man, small as he was, king of it all.
Although it looked like an age-old tradition, the Durbar was invented to promote loyalty and specially staged for newsreel cameras.
Stage management and the stage managing of royalty was an essential aspect of life right the way across Europe. The great monarchies of that time were all of them inventing spectacular ceremonies connected with their monarchy. It's partly, I think, the need for emotion, excitement, hype, as I suppose we would now call it, bread and circuses, as the Romans had called it back in the time of their empire. In 1913, George's cousin, the Kaiser, laid on a spectacular wedding for his daughter in Berlin. All the European monarchs were invited. It was to be the last time they would meet. As a mark of respect, King George wore a German uniform, complete with spiked helmet. But the displays of friendship concealed long-standing national rivalries. The following year, Britain and Germany were at war. George V's cousin, the Kaiser, was transformed into a figure of hatred. As the king toured the front line to boost morale, anti-German feeling was growing in Britain. Rallies were held to denounce Germans. Anyone with a German name or German connection was suspect. Many were deported or driven from their homes. There were witch hunts and spy scares.
They insulted German governesses. They wouldn't listen to German music. They'd even kick Dachshunds in the street. They saw spies under every bed. And the press played this hysteria up and made it worse. They attacked my father because of our German name.
His father was Britain's top admiral, Prince Louis of Battenberg. He had married a granddaughter of Queen Victoria and had served in the British Navy for 47 years, but he was hounded out of office because of his German name and his German blood. King George was worried. Prince Louis was his cousin. His grandmother, Queen Victoria, was from the German House of Hanover. She had married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, another German. The crisis came in 1917, when it looked as though Germany might win the war. People began to mutter that George and his family were really Germans, presiding over what the novelist H.G. Wells called an alien and uninspiring court.
When the king read this, he angrily retorted, "I may be uninspiring, but I'm damned if I'm an alien."
The king and queen were advised to tour industrial areas to quell discontent. Letters sent to the Prime Minister accused the King of disloyalty. When told of them, observers said he started and grew pale.
George V clearly got very worried that people in Britain thought that the monarchy, as embodied by him, was too Germanic, too European, not sufficiently closely associated with Britain itself. In fact, of course, both George V and his wife, Queen Mary, were almost wholly German, and they were very anxious when there was so much anxiety about Germany in the First World War, to recreate and reinvent the British monarchy as being the British monarchy, not a German monarch who happened to be resident in England.
And the easiest way to do this, of course, would be to change their name. So it was then decided to change the name, but nobody quite knew what the name was.
I don't think it was a significant question. They knew who they were. They knew everybody else knew who they were. And they knew vaguely they belonged to a certain family or a certain institution. But I didn't think in terms of surnames.
No one quite knew what the name was. Probably it was Saxe-Coburg-Gotha.
It could have been Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which was Prince Albert's family name, or it could have been Guelph, which was one of the Hanoverian names, or it could have been Wettin, and then there was an even worse one called Whipper.
George V's family name was most likely Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. All the more embarrassing when German Gotha bombers began to raid London. The King's private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, suggested a new name for the dynasty. The name of a castle that had symbolized the monarchy for more than 800 years. Its stone walls as solid and as English as the earth on which it stood. It recalled prancing horses and plumes on cocked hats, and the standard snapping over the round tower. The name struck the right patriotic note, Windsor. In July 1917, a proclamation was issued declaring that the royal family was to be known as the House of Windsor.
And it was on that occasion that the Kaiser, on hearing of this, made quite a good joke. He said in future he would look forward to going to the play The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha.
On the King's orders, Prince Louis of Battenberg's family had to change their name. They translated it to Mountbatten. The King's most embarrassing relations, like the Duke of Coburg, who was fighting on the German side, were cut off completely. The King also decided to reject his Russian cousin, the Tsar, with far more terrible consequences. Russia had fought the war on Britain's side, and the two royal families were very close. Forced to abdicate in 1917 after the February Revolution, the Tsar and his family feared for their lives. They naturally turned to Britain for refuge. The King and government agreed to offer them asylum, but the King's private secretary had other ideas.
Lord Stamfordham came to the King and said, "It is going to make you very unpopular in England if you give sanctuary to a deposed tyrant, as he was thought, such as the Tsar. All the people who are at present clamouring for a republic in England will use this against you." The King got cold feet, and he instructed Stamfordham to reverse the decision on giving asylum to the Tsar, to tell the Russian government that there were various difficulties, and so we could not accept him.
The Tsar and his family were imprisoned for 16 months and then slaughtered. The murders haunted their British relations.
They were all shot together. I believe my cousin Alexei, who was just 14 years old, didn't die at once. He was shot 3 more times. And the following day, my Aunt Elizabeth, who had founded the nursing sister movement and was revered almost as a saint, was also murdered by being flung down a mine shaft.
George V's decision to abandon his cousin and the rest of the Russian royal family was covered up for decades.
If the Tsar had come to England, of course, the terrible massacre of the following year would not have taken place. And what one must say of the king is that he denied the only possible chance of escape to the Tsar. And so the blood of the Tsar, in a sense, rests on the hands of King George V.
He didn't think he was passing a death sentence. He would have felt if he'd had them here, he might have been passing a death sentence on the British monarchy as well as the Russian monarchy. And what good would that have done to the world? So we mustn't give him second sight. He didn't know what was going to happen.
Victory in war did not prevent renewed unrest at home. There were strikes and calls for Russian-style revolution. Troops were called out to keep order. In Ireland, nationalists were repressed by force, but their republicanism seemed to threaten both the crown and the empire. George V used crown and pageantry to strengthen the empire. On St. George's Day 1924, he opened the British Empire exhibition in London.
I declare the British Empire exhibition open.
Crowds flocked to Wembley. The stadium had been transformed into a magnificent theme park with replicas of buildings and settings from different parts of the empire. The king and queen mingled with their subjects. The aim? To promote trade and understanding throughout their realms and territories beyond the seas.
George V was a passionate empire monarch. He believed that it was his destiny to rule over this vast stretch of territory spread around the whole world, which to him meant not merely power, but also almost a kind of mystical glory.
The exhibition was a huge success and a diversion for the British people at a time of economic trouble. In promoting the empire, the king and queen could improve the domestic image of the House of Windsor in the newsreels.
One of the things that George V was very good at was in projecting a curious hybrid image of the British royal family. That is, that on one side it was very splendid and spectacular and ceremonially grand, but on the other side he presented an image with Queen Mary and his children of middle-class, bourgeois, domestic virtue and decency. Now, what is odd about that is that it was, in a sense, a complete fiction, in as much as the fact that the private image of the royal family under George V really didn't square with the public image at all.
George V had no desire to live like a king. He hated royal palaces. He liked Sandringham because he had been brought up there, but he preferred not to live in the big house. Instead, he chose to live in a little house in the grounds, York Cottage, which reminded him of his childhood.
It was a very poky little place, I think. I think my mother thought it was a wretched place. I have a feeling that Queen Mary may have too, but I think the King thought it was the cat's whiskers. It was a wonderful house because he'd partly been brought up there.
The King's eldest son said, "You'll never understand my father until you have seen York Cottage." The King spent his time there sticking stamps into his collection and shooting on the Sandringham estate. Queen Mary was frustrated by the King's resistance to change, as her niece remembers.
Whenever she tried to do anything, George V always said, but I've always had it like this. My mother always did like that. You mustn't touch it, you see.
The King kept her in a very tight rein indeed. I mean, he didn't like to go outside his absolutely rigid routine. He didn't like dining out. He didn't like going to stay in country houses. He didn't like going to the theatre, if he could possibly avoid it. And, of course, she did like that sort of thing. But, of course, in exchange for that, she had a position of immense dignity, of immense wealth, I think one must say, and privilege, and she knew it, and she paid the price for it.
Queen Mary's artistic talents found an unusual outlet.
She liked collecting antiques from people who were not always very willing to let her have them. And there were some pretty awful stories about how she would go to your house, admire something, and make it quite clear that she would wish to be given it. And she would stay there till she got it. Awful case, I know, of Lady Hudson, who had some chairs painted by Angelica Kaufmann. And Queen Mary came to tea, admired these chairs, and said that she had a table painted by Angelica Kaufmann. The chairs would go very well with it. And Lady Hudson did her best. But at 9 p.m., Lady Hudson gave up, and the chairs went off in the Royal Daimler.
In the winter of 1925, the other great influence in the King's life, his mother, Queen Alexandra, died. Her son's wreath carried a simple message. To darling mother dear from your devoted children, George and Mary. The King had adored his mother.
He would ring up and say, "Mother dear, you must not go to church, you've got a bad cold." And if she did go to church, he would be there too and find the places in her prayer book like she would have done for him for a little boy. The trouble was, she never realized that her children grew up. And when he was in his 20s and in command of a ship, he got a letter from her which ended up with a great big kiss for your lovely little face, darling Georgie.
By contrast, George had been intimidated by his father, and that was to poison his relationship with his own children. "I was terrified of my father," he told a friend, "and I am determined that my own children will be terrified of me."
The public image was of a very happy family, a devoted father, devoted mother. But the reality was that the family was really quite unhappy. But nobody knew about it, or at least the great British public didn't know about it. The people in the know knew, but they didn't tell.
King George and Queen Mary had a daughter and 5 sons. The youngest, Prince John, was born epileptic and brain damaged, and kept hidden away until he died at 14. King George based his idea of family life on his own upbringing in the Navy.
I was rather alarmed by him as a child, because I think he shouted at everybody rather like he commanding on a battleship.
Well, he was gruff. He had a gruff voice, he had a gruff manner. It wasn't a disagreeable manner, but it was gruff. I think he expected that if he barked, the barked would be heeded, as it were. He had a bristling beard, so that as a grandchild, your ritual kiss wasn't a wholly agreeable affair.
I remember one case which shows how, without intending to be at all, King George V could be insensitive and indeed almost cruel. It was after the birth of Prince Henry, and the young Prince Edward was very curious and wanted to know how it happened and how did babies come. And the king, with the best possible intentions, produced a story about how the baby had flown in through the window. And so Prince Edward said, but where are its wings? Oh, they always get chopped off, said the king rather gleefully. And this horrific image of the baby having its wings chopped off haunted poor Prince Edward for months and weeks thereafter.
Queen Mary never intervened. She said, I always have to remember that my husband is also my sovereign.
When she saw the king trampling insensitively over her children, bullying and forcing them to do things they didn't want to do, her heart bled, but she never actually turned round to her husband and said, look, you simply can't do this, you must treat your children differently.
Queen Mary was very buttoned up and very unbending. And she didn't find it easy, I think, to discuss vital things, crucial things, to show warmth, as it were, to people.
She just was incapable of what Princess Diana calls hugging. She would never hug anybody spontaneously. Didn't mean she didn't love them, but she didn't know how to express it in a natural way.
The effect of George V's martinet treatment of them and their mother's inhibited treatment of them gave them all certain neuroses. The Prince of Wales was practically anorexic when he was a child. He wouldn't eat, he was obsessive about exercising. He had these nervous tics, he was always fiddling with his cuffs or fiddling with his tie. The poor Prince Albert, the second son, developed a tremendous stammer when he was about 7 years old, which was the central nightmare of his life.
Naturally left-handed, Bertie was forced by his father to write with his right hand. The king also insisted that he wore splints to correct his knock-knees.
Prince Henry, that's the third son, didn't seem to be too badly affected. I don't think he was a man with great nerve endings, really. Prince George, the youngest, became very wild when he was a young man. He went into some pretty dashing nightlife and sex life, and at one point he was addicted to drugs. All of them, I think, drank too much when they were young men, mostly in reaction to the very strict life that they led at home.
It seems almost incredible that the royal princes could have got away with what they did get away with without being exposed to the full glare of publicity. Today, all their imperfections, their derelictions, their drunkenness, drugging, whatever it might be, would be gleefully exploited in the media and thrust down our throats every morning at breakfast.
The media did show the successes of the Prince of Wales. After the war, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, had suggested a new role for the glamorous prince. He should tour the empire to strengthen links to the crown.
That was a very good idea. First of all, it gave the Prince of Wales something to do, but also it was something that the King couldn't have done half as well as the Prince of Wales did it. And it set up a great double act, really, between this quite ordinary, decent, but thoroughly kingly man who stayed at home doing his thing and doing it well, and a young Prince of Wales who seemed very much a man of his generation, and also had the extraordinary and very unusual thing, star quality. The King didn't have star quality. He was kingly, but he wasn't a star. The Prince of Wales was a star. He was wonderful at talking to people in a relaxed way and making them feel $1 million. He could make speeches off the cuff, just at whistle stops, and people would go away with a song in their hearts.
The prince was the first royal superstar, but the glamorous public image was at odds with the grim private reality. The prince was depressed and on the edge of a nervous breakdown. He was lonely and plagued with self-doubt, as a letter to his private secretary Godfrey Thomas reveals.
This was a frantic cry for help, written on Christmas Day, almost suicidal, and needless to say, it worried my father absolutely stiff. A sort of hopelessly lost feeling has come over me, and I think I'm going kind of mad. I feel faint at the thought of next year's trip. Christ, how I loathe my job now, and all this press-puffed empty success. I feel I'm through with it, and long to die. I tell you as my greatest friend and the one man I can trust and who really understands me. I do feel such a bloody little shit.
The famous double act between the King and the Prince of Wales was publicly successful, but privately riddled with tension. The prince felt his father didn't appreciate his efforts. The public applauded, but his father could only criticize.
Things which King George V said to his courtiers show that he genuinely thought that the Prince of Wales had made a marvellous job of, for instance, his trip to Australia, in which he'd been mobbed with the most hysterical scenes. But all he said to the Prince of Wales was, I noticed that you were wearing the wrong spurs with the wrong set of boots, or that you really ought not to be seen smoking in public, or it was all the silly little criticisms.
The king was dismayed by his son's headstrong ways and restless desire for change. The deepest differences were over the prince's love affairs with a series of married women, like Frida Dudley Ward, which stopped him making a suitable marriage. Most of the prince's circle were getting married, but he only appeared at weddings as best man. When his friend Louis Mountbatten married, Mountbatten was still suffering from his father's recent death.
The prince came in to comfort him and said, but I envy you being able to weep for your father. If my father died, I'd be glad.
In 1928, the king fell seriously ill. The whole nation followed the daily bulletins on his declining health. The Prince of Wales, on tour in Kenya, was urgently recalled by a telegram from the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin.
When Lascelles, his private secretary, showed him this telegram, he said, oh, silly old Baldwin, just an electoral dodge, I'm not going. So Lascelles got furious and he said, "Sir, the King of England is dying. And if that doesn't matter to you, it certainly matters to us." And the Prince of Wales simply shrugged his shoulders and gave him a look and went out and went on with his plans for seducing the wife of a local colonial official, and was very happy to tell Lascelles that he'd done so the next morning.
Lascelles resigned. The rest of the prince's staff finally persuaded him to return home. But they were full of foreboding that he was unfit for the throne he would inherit if his father died. The nation's prayers were answered. The king's life was spared. He made a slow and painful recovery at Bognor, by the sea, with his granddaughter, Princess Elizabeth. Before the king left, seeking to immortalize the royal link with their town, the Bognor Town Council paid a visit to his private secretary, Lord Stamfordham.
He went along to the king's study and he said, "The town council is here and they want to call Bognor Regis." And the king, who was rather fussed, preparing to go back to Windsor, said, "Oh, bugger Bognor." And Lord Stamfordham bowed, returned to the delegation, and said, "His Majesty has been graciously pleased to accede to your request."
The king returned to duty, greatly strengthened in the nation's affections. Despite his limited horizons, George had built up a reputation as a solid constitutional monarch, dispensing common sense advice.
George V's notion of what the monarch was for in terms of politics was that he envisaged it as a sort of referee, that he was presiding over different football teams of political parties, as you might say, and that on the whole he saw his job as being to bring warring political parties together when there were periods of national crisis.
The national crisis came with the Great Economic Depression of 1931. As trade slumped and unemployment rocketed, the Labour government split. The king hated socialism, but found nothing to fear in the Labour governments of Ramsay MacDonald. When MacDonald wanted to resign over the crisis, the king asked him to stay on and lead a national coalition. The royal persuasion worked, leaving MacDonald in a Conservative alliance which his own Labour Party disowned.
The king took a very decisive step in that crisis, which was, I think, a disastrous step, although it was perfectly constitutional. Nobody could say it wasn't constitutional. He advised the Prime Minister of the day, Ramsay MacDonald, as he was perfectly entitled to do, to form a national government. He begged him to do so. And Ramsay MacDonald, very misguidedly, agreed to do it and formed a national government. As a result, the country was deprived of an effective opposition for a decade during which it was particularly necessary that the country should have an opposition.
Opposition was forced onto the streets when the National Coalition won a landslide election victory. To the unemployed, it looked as though the king had created a royal government, while the depression went on. The king pleaded for unity through the new medium of wireless.
Through one of the marvels of modern science, I am enabled this Christmas Day to speak to all my peoples throughout the empire.
I shall always remember as a small boy listening to George V's Christmas broadcasts. His voice was extraordinary because it had a slightly sort of whiskey sort of timbre to it, as you know, it had a gamey timbre to it. It was august, but it was also intimate. He hated doing it, but he was a broadcasting natural.
The King's first Christmas broadcast in 1932 instantly created a new royal tradition.
And to those who are celebrating this day with their children and their grandchildren, to all, to each, I wish a happy Christmas. God bless you.
He wasn't a very clever man, but his heart beat with England. There's no question about that. He knew exactly the heartbeat of England, and England knew his heartbeat. No question about it. He was a very great old king, in many respects.
At his Silver Jubilee in 1935, the King was surprised by the degree of public adulation. What the public did not know was that for their beloved King and Queen, there was a shadow over the Jubilee celebrations. The Prince of Wales insisted on flaunting his latest love, the twice-married American Wallis Simpson, at the Jubilee Ball.
Mrs. Simpson was there. The King and Queen didn't know that she was invited. And I remember I was at that ball, and I remember there was a sort of frisson. And one didn't know quite what it was. But what had happened was that Queen Mary said, "Who is this woman?" And the Prince of Wales had left in a temper with her, with Mrs. Simpson.
The King's thoughts turned towards his second son, Bertie. His Scottish wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, was a great support to him and very popular. They perpetuated the Windsor image of the happy family, and their daughter Elizabeth guaranteed the future of the dynasty. But Bertie was not the heir to the old king's throne.
If by a wave of the wand he had been able to remove the Prince of Wales from the scene, to in some way reverse the orders over his second son, the Duke of York, instead became heir to the throne, I have no doubt at all that he would have done so.
By the end of his Jubilee year, the old king was sinking. His doctor and friend, Lord Dawson, wanted to save the family from stress. The Queen begged him not to prolong the king's suffering. He wrote out on the back of a menu card a bulletin for the BBC.
This is London. Following bulletin was issued at 9:25. The King's life is moving peacefully towards its close.
We now know that that is not true. That within 2 hours of writing that famous bulletin, Lord Dawson of Penn went to the King's bedroom, picked up 2 syringes. One he loaded with a lethal dose of cocaine, the other with a lethal dose of morphine. And he said to the nurse, "Inject these into the King's jugular vein." The nurse refused, and so Lord Dawson did the job himself. And within an hour or so, the King was dead.
Millions listened until after midnight, when the nation heard that the King was dead.
Lord Dawson thought the King ought to die before midnight, so that the news of his death could be announced in the Times newspaper the next morning, and not in what he called lesser organs of the afternoon.
The Times got its scoop, but the real story of this act of royal euthanasia went unreported for 50 years. Genuine grief for the king convulsed the nation. Those in the know were worried about the Prince of Wales, now proclaimed king.
Whereas it hath pleased Almighty God,
The new King, Edward VIII, broke with tradition to watch the ceremony. Beside him was the woman his father found so unsuitable, and whom he now intended to make his queen.
God save the King.
The coming year would confirm the old king's worst fears. It would split the royal family and pit brother against brother.
The Windsors, a royal family, will continue in a moment. You can purchase The Windsors on video for $29.95 plus shipping and handling. To order this 4-hour series, call WGBH Boston Video at 1-800-255-9424.
You're watching PBS.